Hi there, my name is Celia Grand, and I've been a psychotherapist for about 45 years. And my practice is in Cape Elizabeth, Maine. And I mostly am an EMDR therapist, but I'm also and I also work for the EMDR Institute as well as my clinical practice. I'm also a past trainer in a particular method for body-oriented psychotherapy called sensory motor psychotherapy. In my recent years, I've been really interested in how the brain takes on trauma. And with the advent of neuroscience, and especially the last 5 years, but the last 10, 15 years, neuroscience researchers and psychotherapy have come together. And so in the last 5 years, we've gotten a lot more information. So even though I'm a body-oriented psychotherapist, and I do believe in the nervous system does orient us towards trauma, also the brain is impacted. So I am going to start with what I'm hoping to help you understand is the impact of trauma on the brain, and that trauma affects our sense of self and how we understand ourselves, how we orient through the world, how we believe or don't believe in ourselves. So trauma affects our sense of self. Also, trauma's not what happened to you when something happens, it's what's still in you and still happening. So we often, if we've had a trauma exposure and or multiple exposures, we're reliving trauma versus remembering trauma. So the brain has a wonderful way of a self-protective measurement around how it's going to not take in too much information. A couple of Jenny and Karen did talk about, and Steve mentioned too, about the field of consciousness. When we have an event, our field of consciousness narrows so that the brain can just go into survival brain, and it has to shut off our emotions and our ability to think things through, planning. And I'm going to talk about why that happens. And then the things that we need to do so that we remember trauma. What is remembering trauma? You can think about, know what happened to you, but there's no reaction. So I'm going to talk a little bit about reliving versus remembering. And then, like, as Jenny and Karen also talked about, was moral injury. And I'm going to come from a moral injury from what we call a not me state, meaning you don't feel like yourself anymore. And something has changed in you. And you want to go back to who you were before. And you may never go back to the way you were before, but there's a way in which our brains can make meaning and sense out of our experience so that we can remember trauma with lessons learned. We can understand a greater meaning and purpose, or we can have a spiritual orientation towards what happened to us. So I'm going to talk about how the brain has a way to protect and for us to move forward. And sometimes we move forward with a suitcase on our back with lots of pain, or we can move forward with remembering what happened to us and not have that visceral and emotional and psychological reaction. So to start, I came up with this concept of the 4 dimensions of self. And I wanted to start with what is a healthy self. So this is sort of a diagram. It's really hard to diagram, internal consciousness processes in an easy and deliverable way. But at our core self, that inner circle where it says me, like right here, the me is the way that we experience ourselves and how we orient through the world and how we understand ourselves in the world. So there's 4 dimensions, and the first dimension is this neural self, and that's our biological processes, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that how the brain takes in on a somosensory level, deep brain. So the brain is like, there's the brain stem, and then the prefrontal cortex comes out in the front, but most of trauma is lodged in the midbrain. So the neural self is all the ways in which our brain processes takes in information. If it evaluates that we're safe, then the prefrontal cortex can make meaning out of our experiences. But if we're unsafe, then on that deep level, your orienting response is going to be compromised, and your ability to make meaning out of the experience is compromised. And then we feel, so the second dimension is the embodied self. And so we feel, that's our felt sense. And in the felt sense, when we orient to something that's dangerous, we're going to have a lot of autonomic nervous system activation. And that will either be in a hyper-aroused or sympathetic, meaning we're outside of our ability to think, to know what we feel, and to take action. Action is really important when you're in a trauma response, especially with first responders and or for the investigators who do child exploitation. So in that sense, our bodies are telling us what's dangerous and not dangerous. So the embodied self is our felt experience, and that's how our bodies are taking in. So the brain is taking in an orienting response. I'm going to really unpack this in a little bit. We feel, and the third dimension is how we understand and make meaning, right here, make meaning out of our lives, and understand what happened to us. And then our transcendent self is our spiritual self. So those are the components that make up the self according to Celia Grand. Now, I'm sure there's probably lots of people out there saying what the self is, and that was my initial investigation, is we talk about the self, but how does the self know itself, was my question. So the me, that's the you who experiences life through these dimensions. And then around the me is this unconscious mind and body experiences. And these can be anywhere from our defenses. So we have certain defenses that when we're under stress will get kicked in. So for example, if you're in a stress response, you may go into fight flight, and you may either go into action or you may shut down. After the abuse, you may have a defense around your lens sees trauma or danger all the time, so you may be mobilizing yourself, and or you may start projecting and having certain people look like dangerous people. So different defenses help us try to make sense and get back into that state of homeostasis that Karen was talking about. That's a state of inner balance. We also have strategies to cope. We have memory networks. We have parts of self that get split off. We have differences in our emotional regulation. And I talked about felt sense and positive emotions and our well-being. All of these things are happening at the same time always. So we have the how I'm experiencing the world, and then we have these unconscious mind and body experiences, and then this I, right here, that's the you who deals in the world. Your I is engaging with me right now. You're understanding what you're experiencing, and you're engaging in a learning experience. But the I deals with life outside of yourself. So how you engage, and that's the periphery. So our periphery is the skin, and then what's outside of us. So outside of us, like Steve mentioned already with the nervous system, we're always picking up information. We're picking up cues from our environment, what's safe, what's not safe, and our brains are trying to digest it at the same time. So that is the essence of what the dimensions of self are. So this slide just says that when we're under trauma, that the neural self is going to activate orienting response and our somosensory system is activated. So all animals in the wild orient to threat and danger or safety. Karen showed the slide of the tiger, and I think it was, I'm not sure what the other animal was. That's a hard system. That's a biological driven system that when right now, what's happening in Maine right now, most of us are in shock. The people going to find this perpetrator is now in a heightened response of trying to get the take action to catch this guy, right? So our neural self is orienting to danger, and our bodies are picking up those cues on a felt level. So the embodied level of the dimension would be our autonomic nervous system gets activated, and I'm going to talk about these networks in the brain called the theory of the mind, of how our minds get intertwined with the experiencing of what our systems are doing. And then our cognitive, we have post-trauma. Many people have ruminations, they're overthinking, they can't get images out of their minds. And especially for those who investigate and have repeated exposure of watching the same thing, you're going to have those images that won't leave your brain. And then the transcendent, the spiritual self, that's where moral injury or a spiritual crisis or that loss of meaning and purpose, or why am I even doing this job? Because you wonder, you're in the trenches digging it out, and then for what? For what purpose does it serve? And so your spirit gets diminished. That's the lay of the land of the dimensions of self. And I wanted to put that out there so that you have an orientation towards what happens to me, what happens to my sense of self. Why is it that I feel what I feel and I do what I do when it doesn't feel like I am who I am? So I know that's like kind of a Dr. Seuss kind of statement, but there's a truth there. We doubt ourselves, we doubt what we're doing, and we doubt what we're experiencing. So when we're reliving versus remembering, traumatic memories, this is a take-home for you, is not in your head, it's in your body. So we feel these sensory and motor fragments. And I'm going to go into where the parts of the brain hold that and why it goes to your body and why you can't make meaning and why you keep having those ruminations and those images that keep going through your head. So when something happens, we're shocked, we get disoriented, we ruminate, we feel stress. I mean, all of us are having a collective trauma. Some people are out there doing the brave work to secure our safety and our state. But the rest of us are watching this, helpless, either in your offices, if you're an investigator or policing, you're going to feel helpless. And those of us watching on TV, as a citizen, many people are afraid. Many people are shocked. Most of us believe that Maine was just this very safe state, that this would never happen in our backyard. And so we're all in this collective trauma on the heels of what Steve mentioned, the pandemic. We were in a collective trauma. So we're all experiencing something. But here's the kick in the pants. Not all of us are going to have trauma. Some of you are going to work through this in your way, and you're going to be okay. You're not going to have these visceral responses. That's going to be dependent on how many trauma exposures you have in your life. The less trauma exposures in your life over time, when something like this happens, if you reach out to your colleagues, if you hug your family, you're probably going to get through this even if you were out in the field actively searching for this person, or if you're sitting behind a screen with watching child exploitation. So the more the trauma you have in your history, the more likely you're going to have some kind of trauma effect. So what happens when we're reliving trauma? When we have a trauma exposure, our brains go into the fight-flight, but underneath the fight-flight, there's this innate alarm system in the brainstem. And the thalamus is a brain structure that when something happens, there's what we call trace memory that are across your brain. And the thalamus is like a relay system. And it goes, hey, incoming information. And then all of those trace memories are coming together to form some kind of understanding of what's happening. So that detection of threat then kicks off another part of the brain. It's called the paradoxical gray area, and it's in the cerebellum. It is right next to the amygdala, and underneath that is a brain structure. I'm going to talk a little bit more about this, the superior colliculi. That's where your orienting response is. But when that's detected, the PAG has what we call an emotional operating system. We have hardwire emotions at birth, and then they get stimulated and formed into greater neural networks depending on our attachment relationships. So we can't get away from childhood, unfortunately. Most people who come into therapy go, and especially if they've had trauma exposure, and it's an event trauma, and they go, I don't want to talk about my mother or my father. But at the end of the day, if you had some ruptures in attachment, your ability to overcome, this is the ACEs study, overcome trauma is going to be affected, and your ability to metabolize trauma in your adult life. So this innate alarm system is online all of the time, so that if you had a lot of alarm when you were a child, this alarm system is now screeching, right? So this is our detector of something going on. So when that alarm system goes off, that part of the brain, it's called the superior colliculi right here. This is the part of the brain structure that we orient to what's happening. And it also is trying to integrate sensory information. But here's the problem, and that is below the amygdala. The amygdala, which most people understand is the fight-flight, is in the cerebellum with the PAG, is right here. So these guys are kind of close together, but here's the problem. When we see things, light comes into our eyes, it goes to the retina turns on these neurons, and that information is going all the way back to this brain, into the deep brain. That's going to kick off our somosensory. So soma is body, and sensory is sensation and emotion. And when we hear things, the sound, there's two branches in the ear. There's this one that comes up here, which is going to be around the thalamus, coming up into the midbrain, up into the thalamus. And that's that part of the hearing neuron pathway. is you're listening to me right now. So you're hearing me, what I'm saying. But also sound goes into the midbrain, into this area. And what's really interesting about the vestibular system, if anybody's ever had vertigo, that's your vestibular system is out of whack. And when we hear things, it's like a force. And that force is a gravitational pull. It keeps our bodies, our minds and our bodies in sync in space and time. So you don't think about how much energy and what's going on in your system when you're just walking around. But if you trip on something, your brain is now going to try to get you back up to stand. Well, that's this part of the brain right here is your proprioceptive awareness, what your body is in space and time. Why is that important? Because when this is off, this is where dissociation, derealization, depersonalization. Now, these are big defenses that I talked about in the sense of self. Dissociation is your inability to be in time and space, your ability to be aware of what's happening to you. So you're out of present awareness. Derealization feels like, I'm not in reality. This doesn't feel like reality. I feel like disoriented and not in reality. And depersonalization is like, I don't feel myself. So your brain is taking in information, and if your amygdala, if your orienting response gets fixated on an image or a sound, your superior colleculi is now oriented to danger, and the PAG that's over here is now flooding with emotion. It can be panic, anxiety, rage, shame, grief. So now there's like a seizing, an overload within the brain, and this is happening in milliseconds when it's getting downloaded. So this is getting downloaded from the deeper part of the midbrain. But here is where the problem lies. The biggest problem is this reticular activation system. What happens is now all of that incoming information is coming in, and now you're aroused. Well, the problem with it is that this is a bidirectional brain structure, the reticular activating system, and in a perfect world, if you were able to orient to what you were experiencing and it could come up to the prefrontal cortex, you would orient, understand, take action, be okay. But when information comes in and it gets stuck here, right, because, and I'm going to talk about this, why it can't go up to the upper parts of the brain, guess where it goes? It goes in the body. So when in the vestibular area, that's the area where we get a sense of safety, grounding, security. That's really important, that if you're exposed to something, you still feel okay, you feel safe, even in the exposure. So for some people who are active law enforcement, their training is going to kick in. And if your training is kicked in and you don't have a boatload of trauma coming into that trauma experience, there should be a less likelihood that you're going to have some kind of aftermath. So like what's happening right now in our state, most people are in acute trauma. You're oriented towards what's happening. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but you're in law enforcement, so you're probably getting updates. Those of us who are just civilians, I'm watching the TV going like, what's going on? Are they catching this guy, right? So my system is oriented towards, I don't know what's happening. In my life, if I didn't know what was happening, then that's going to create, it's going to activate what I already know about what I don't know and my reaction. So we get on edge, something happens, and we have a little emotional reaction because stress begets stress. So This right here is where we want to work in treatment to get all of that uncoupled, and so that the brain settles enough so that that information can come up to the prefrontal cortex and you can make meaning out of your experience. When we make meaning, when we understand, our system settles. If it doesn't, then we're more likely to have PTSD. So, again, when we're reliving trauma, so this is now going up into the how the brain stores trauma. So I went from normal brain to what happens in the moment, and now when you see horror, if you are an investigator of child exploitation, when you see these images and you hear the children and you can't get those images or that sound out of your head, it's because you're orienting, your superior colleculi is orienting to the trauma, and you're going to have a visceral reaction. Usually, and it's not a big reaction, usually when we witness horror, our neck will get a little bit of attention, we'll orient before we can recognize it. So sometimes when people are orienting, they go into a shock. It stops everything. And shock is probably the hardest piece of trauma, of undoing the shock that one experienced. So, for example, when Jenny was talking and she said those protective measures around what investigators said that they did, which was they were able to shut off their thoughts. They kind of just shut off their emotions and just got hyper-focused. Well, there was a choice there that all I'm going to do is choose, like it's almost like an intentional dissociation, right, to the horror. And then there's this pre-affective shock, which is the emotional part of the brain that takes on the trauma. And then there's the defenses, which I talked about. So I'm not going to go through those because I already talked about them. The derealization, depersonalization. So that memory gets stored, and here's where the sense of self now comes back. This is called the theory of the mind, and that there's 3 systems. The easiest way to talk about this, because it's pretty complicated, but the easiest is our default mode. Our default mode is this sort of circuitry that's always taking in. Your brain is taking in, even outside of your awareness, it's taking in. And it's going to that me state. It's saying, okay, this is information that I need to pay attention to. When our default mode is in balance, we're creative, we have a sense of well-being, we can think about the future. When it's not in balance, and this is really your take-home, this is the storehouse for your negative beliefs, those ruminations, those I statements, I'm not lovable, I'm unworthy, I'm helpless, I'm powerless. The other network that works pretty closely with the default mode is the salience network. The salience network is that feel network. So that's lodged in that deep part of the brain where I was just talking about, and when that goes off, it shuts off the central executive network. That's our ability to plan, rationalize, think things through. And so that's shut off. The salience network is saying, pay attention, and the default mode is going, I'm powerless, I'm powerless. So now in a PTSD moment, your mind is unable to process information. So as we're reliving trauma, once the experience is over, and here is really one of the more important pieces that you'll take home, it is just what happens. There's a split in the sense of self. There's a part of us that is holding all of those components. Remember in that midbrain, all those somosensory, the sensations, the images, the thoughts, the body sensation, what we did and didn't do in terms of action system, our movements, are all encapsulated in a past. So, and our brains help us to just go on with daily life. Well, those of you who are investigators or police officers, you have to do that almost every single call or every single investigation that you're doing. You have to hurry up and get back on the street or get back onto work and leave behind what you experienced, the horror. So our brains are designed to do that. The problem with that, it saves the moment, but in the end, we end up with PTSD symptoms, because what happens is then you go home and you go to hug your kid and you just saw a kid being abused. There's a cognitive dissonance. It can't match. It doesn't match up. So you have to repress all of those feelings, or you may go into a defense, avoidance. Avoidance is the #1 PTSD symptom. We don't want to go back to the scene of the crime. We don't want to remember. We don't want to think about it. So we continue to keep that split. But again, cumulative trauma over time, you can't contain it. You can't walk away. And then what happens is that moment that something happens. So this is a term that I came up with many years ago. I worked in mental health. And it was actually before we even were dealing with sexual abuse. And we had all these people coming in. We were dealing with mostly like adult children of alcoholics. It was the late 80s. And alcoholism, substance abuse was just really coming into treatment. And we were seeing these folks that were coming in with these horrific symptoms. So in our team, I'm sure I don't know if people still do it, but in the day when I worked in mental health systems, we often sublimated our pain and what we were going through with humor. So, and I'm sure you guys do that. Like, it's almost like the way that you could get through, and that's the defense called sublimation. And so I came up with this term called a psychotlet. We now call them triggers, but I like the term psychotlet because it's a state of extreme mind, body, and spiritual distress. That's when our body tightens, we feel confused, our mind races, we become reactive with uncontrollable emotions, or a dorsal, which is a shutdown. We go into a state, and it's the moment that our whole system is seizing. And then deep wounds of insecurity and overwhelm our spirit. So it's this moment in time. And it's that moment where you can't continue to go on with daily life and something happens and you're just in a triggered psychotlet state. And so how do we relive it? We flood. Flooding is when all the sensory and emotional components of the traumatic experience, we start reliving it. We have flashbacks. Those are the images that come back into mind. And the ruminations are our overthinking. And when all of that is happening at one time, you're like, holy shit, what's going on with me, right? And it's very disorienting, and it's really hard to kind of get through that moment. And we have lots of defenses to try to get out of those, but that's what's happening. And this is what's happening maybe not in the moment. Like Jenny said, there's some investigators with child exploitation that have that dissociation, or the intentional dissociation where they can do that, but they're still taking in information. Probably the things that Jenny said that were the two things that I would think that were more important to protect your brains if you're a child investigator is turning down the volume. That vestibular system is not going to be taking that in. And if you start to feel your body starting to go into some defense, or you're zoning out, than to take that image and make it smaller so you're not seeing the whole thing. I think those are the two protective measures that probably would be more helpful to you. So as Karen talked about moral injury, it's the suffering that you experience when you or someone else makes a decision that goes against your morals in a high-stakes situation. So that's where the not me starts coming in, like, I'm doing this job, I'm trying to help children, but I'm being affected, or I'm doing my job as a police officer and people like spit on me or do horrible things to me. And then we go, why am I doing this? And so moral injury is both this PTSD with all of those feelings that come up that get stored from that PAG. So often experiencing sorrow, grief, shame, regret, alienation, lack of trust. And then we're feeling that, and then we get these symptoms at the same time, and then we don't know what to do with them. So there's this overlap of feelings where it's kind of natural and normal to feel angry and depressed and anxious, not sleep, have migraines and nightmares. But here's the problem. You have to go home with that, or you're living with it and you're trying to stuff it down and you can't stuff it down. So at some point there's a breaking point. So the not me state is I don't feel myself. So if you start to feel like, I don't feel like I'm myself anymore, like this is changing me, or I'm not doing the same things that I used to do that made me, that I had joy or happiness with. Or we start to reenact the trauma, meaning it won't leave your head, it won't leave your body. You're reenacting. You may go home and not be able to engage with your family, or you might have substance use, or there's a high incidence of domestic violence. And so you're reacting, you're reliving and reacting, and you can't get this out of you. And you don't know who you are anymore, so that's a not me state. But there is hope, and this afternoon we're all going to talk about what can you do so that you're ending up remembering trauma and not reliving trauma. You're okay. You feel acts of triumph. You feel like some of your work is really making some headway along the way, and you feel like you're doing the best that you can, and you can feel proud of what you're doing. And you're living your purpose, and that's a me state. That's restoring that inner core of me where I feel I'm okay, I'm proud, I'm living my purpose. So remembering trauma is when it's in our past, and we have the appropriate emotional responses. You feel like you're in the present while remembering the past. So you're not experiencing the PTSD, you're knowing what happened to you, and it makes sense to you. And you have an awareness of yourself that's maintained as yourself, and the part of you that experienced it and the part of you right now is in unison. And we update what we call the mental time traveler. When you're in PTSD, you're in the past. When we're remembering trauma, that time orientation, because here's what happens. When you're remembering trauma, that part of your brain, that midbrain, doesn't know the difference between time and space. So we're updating the file so that you can go back and remember, but you can also be present at the same time. So the last slide here is the restoration of the self. And you're in the present, so the neural self, you're not stuck in a moment in time, or you're not in your past. Your emotions, you're calm, you can remember the trauma. Your memories are in the past, so there's a different time orientation, and you can feel gratitude and joy and connected. And that part of your brain that shut down, the Central Executive Network can make meaning out of the experiences that you've had and are having. So everything comes together in a way that you understand who you are, what you're doing, how you're doing it, and whatever happens to you gets put in a place and you can move on with daily life. And that's really, really important when you do the hard work. And the last thing I would just want to say, because Karen talked about therapy, and that maybe some law enforcement is afraid of therapy. Those of you who do child investigations, or those of you who are going on calls, you see the faces, you hear the voices of what's happening in that moment in time, and that's getting locked in. Well, I want to let you know, I'm on the cleanup crew. I'm the one that sees the same exact face and hears the same cries, but the difference between me and you is that you don't know where that case is going. Because I'm on the treatment end, I have some power tools. EMDR, I'm going to talk about that this afternoon, is a beautiful power tool that helps get those images out of your head. And I see the horror when someone first comes in, and then I can do a treatment, and I see a different person. I hear a different person, I'm talking to a different person, from someone who's traumatized to someone who is remembering their trauma. So trauma is not what happened to you. Trauma still is what's happening, but there are treatments and there are practices, there are skills, there's awareness that you can have to heal that trauma. And I've been a trauma therapist pretty diligently since 1996. And I have done thousands of EMDR sessions. I've worked trauma through the body. My whole life has been dedicated to understanding trauma. And I understand that when you're experiencing trauma, you don't think there's any way out. But I can guarantee you that there is a way out. And because you need help to understand why your brain has stored this memory, doesn't mean that you're weak. It means you're strong if you go for help. Because you shouldn't be living with the things, the images, and the experiences that you've had. So my hope for you is that this little brain hour helped you to understand what's happening in your brain so that you don't think it's a personal weakness. That you see that your brain is doing exactly what it's designed to do. When all of the stuff that I talked about was that your brain's in survival brain. You can't live there. You have to move out of that survival brain and into a more holistic way of being. So I thank you for your time and your attention. I really appreciate it. I hope this was a little primer to help you understand who you are, how trauma interfaces with that, and how to overcome trauma. Thank you.